Now I would like to interview Anne Macy. Anne Macy was responsible for the livestock, was leading the livestock working group. And Anne, when you accepted that mandate, the livestock section is quite is a big section. There are many clauses, and so how did you approach this mandate? What was your objective when accepting to review this big section of the standard?
Well, the other problem with that is not only is it big, it's also the section that has created some of the most problems in terms of interpretation. So during this revision process, what we wanted to do was to try and write it more clearly and make sure the intent of the livestock standard came across to prevent what has been happening in the past was you were getting different interpretations of different sections by the producers and by inspectors. So we looked at it, we tried to take out words like adequate, appropriate, sufficient that could be ambiguous and interpreted in different ways. So that was one of our main objectives, and then of course to address the concerns that had been people had commented on and sent in to do with where they thought the standard was lacking, or where they didn't understand it, or where they thought the intent wasn't being met by producers that they had seen. So we tried to address all of those things.
So you were looking for better clarity. So that would be great to go through some examples. So what are the modifications that you brought concerning animal welfare specifically?
Yes, there were quite a lot of comments about that we needed to improve this and be more explicit about animal welfare, because although to us it's implicit that high animal welfare standards are what the livestock production standards are all about, people weren't reading it or understanding it that way. So we added in at the beginning in the general section a totally new paragraph emphasizing the principle that operators have to have a commitment to animal welfare. So they're being asked to demonstrate that commitment. And we added quite a specific text there which said, if a problem is identified, whether it's by the producer himself or the inspector or some other outside agency that is reviewing the practices on that farm, that if there is a problem, the operator has to show that they've addressed the problem. We've also added in specifics in different sections. In the feed section where it talks about feed for young mammals, we expanded that, which talked about the scenarios when a young calf, for example, is removed from its mother, is not nursing naturally, how is it fed? We added in a requirement for artificial teats, which wasn't there before. So that is so that it's a accepted practice now because it satisfies the motivation for the young calves to suck. So it's considered, the appropriate way to feed if you're going to be giving organic milk directly to the calves. We also tackled the questions that had arisen to do with the use of tie stalls and electric trainers. Because many producers are still operating with older facilities and haven't upgraded or built new barns, the reality out there is that there are organic producers where certainly in the winter months the cows spend a lot of time in tie stalls. And so there was previously requirements, to ensure that the cows have exercise periods, and then the topic of electric trainers came up because some producers in some provinces are using trainers to train the cows when they're in the stalls. We didn't think that this was something which should be allowed to continue, so it generated a lot of debate. So we ended up by putting some additional text in the standard to show that there is an end to these derogations. If you're currently using trainers, then you have to put in extra facilities so that the cow doesn't actually hit the electric wire, but learns about it, and that within 5 years all this has to be discontinued. So it's moving producers in the direction we want to see them going, but not demanding changes immediately, which are basically impossible to meet just because of the setup of their barn currently, and they will take time to do the renovations necessary. The other thing that was important as far as animal welfare, the standard previously hadn't been read so people understood that farrowing crates for sows weren't allowed. It wasn't clearly stated that way, so we added it in this time. So they're just some of the examples to do with animal welfare where we expanded sections or were more precise in different areas to show where we were going.
So there is a derogation for tie stalls. It is a 5-year derogation?
Well, it's not exactly. This is the way it is. Tie stalls are prohibited currently in new construction and major renovations, but it says if you're using tie stalls, what the derogation is about is that you have to make sure you comply with exercise periods, and you mustn't tether heifers or dry cows. It's just for the dairy herd. And so we added in extra requirements there, but they have to be able to meet those requirements. It doesn't say actually that tie stalls have to all disappear within 5 years.
Okay, but just to be clear, after 5 years, so dairy farmers will still have the capacity to raise their livestock in tie stalls if they have exercised?
No, not to raise them. They're allowed to use they'll still be allowed to use tie stalls for the dairy herd. They cannot keep heifers in tie stalls or dry cows in tie stalls. So it's moving away. I mean, it's moving away from the standard barn. So we're expecting that there will be renovations over that period to address that, and it will move people away from using it. And lots of operators are building new barns or are retiring, and so their old facilities are retiring with them. So.
Yeah. And you also introduced new requirements about the transitioning of herds in the livestock section. What are those new those clarification about transitioning?
Yes, 6.3.3 had been interpreted over the years to include all livestock, although actually the original intent, I'm convinced, was really just about dairy herds, and then we expanded it to everything, and then people had asked, so there was a sick interpretation that said yes, it applied to poultry as well. So when we looked at it, it's actually very difficult to apply that in the terms of poultry and in terms of some of the, and we found that we actually couldn't explain what it meant. So our conclusion was that really no, this did not apply to poultry. So we reworded it. So it's just when you're initially transitioning a flock of sheep or a herd of cows, this is how that you can bring the farm through transition and the animals on that farm at the same time. And that was what it was all about. And we tried to word it so it accurately reflects that. We shall see whether we've succeeded, I guess, when people...
So what it means is that when you transition your land with your herd at the same time, It says that the feed produced on your land on the third year of the transition period may be considered organic for your transitioning herd. But if the herd is transitioned before, is totally transitioned before the end of before the 3 years, is the third year crop still organic?
No, I mean the idea isn't that you transition a herd before it. The idea was that they're being transitioned simultaneously, so that by the time your crops are ready, by the time your land meets that 36 months, you can bring your livestock into organic production at the same time.
Okay, yeah, I see.
See, it wasn't that, okay, we can, go into transition and have our land take 3 years, but have a dairy herd that's organic before that time. No, that wasn't it at all. So, as I say, I'm still not sure we've achieved what we had set out to do with the understanding, but that is the intent.
So the sector will learn and month and year after year to implement it correctly. And you worked very hard on outdoor access, specifically for birds and poultry. What are your new propositions? What are the modifications that you introduced to focus to emphasize outdoor access for poultry?
Yes, well, the standard has always required outdoor access for all livestock, poultry included. And there are several paragraphs and sentences which mention this in the poultry section, but it seems that as we have expanded production, there's been quite a lot of comments that we've received saying that especially in some of the larger operations, that really birds aren't getting out the way we would expect them to. So we had a look at all the sections. We got some information from what was happening elsewhere, and there are two things that are important in getting birds outside, having agreed that that's what we want to do. One is the ability for them to get out of the barn, and the other is what's going on in the range outside for it to be attractive to bird use. So we started, we put in a number of different things to do with range. We tried to emphasize that the birds should go outside. So we just, in fact, said, trying to find the actual wording here to give you, because we just added a few words. Range has to be managed in a way that encourages use by the birds, and it has to show signs of use. So we were trying to encourage producers to understand your objective is to get the birds outside, not to find reasons why they shouldn't go outside. I mean, we recognize there are challenges with disease and different things like that, but there has to be an understanding of the intent, and there has to be some proactive work to encourage that. So another of the sections that has always been there, it says birds shall have sufficient exit areas to ensure that all birds shall have ready access, or barns should have sufficient exit areas to ensure all birds shall have ready access to the outdoors. This, we know, was not happening. So we debated long and hard and had many discussions. It was perhaps the most challenging of the discussions we had about whether to include a minimum number and size of exits for poultry and what those numbers should be. In the end, we decided to include it. We looked at examples where operators were getting birds outside, looked at what would be appropriate. We put those numbers in. We added the option so that if your barn doesn't meet those requirements, and if you don't think you need to put in more exit holes, then as long as you could demonstrate that whatever system you have the birds are going out and utilizing range, then that was fine. So it's more prescription, but at the same time allowing an outcome result if you don't meet those particular requirements. But if you're building a new facility, you have to put those in, and then we're saying, okay, we know if you have this amount of exits, if you open the doors, the birds are going outside. And that's what, consumers expect from organic production, that birds are on range, they have outdoor access, that they're raised as naturally as possible, and so that's what we were trying to do. And we've added some other sections where we actually specify, if you've got meat chickens, they should be out on pasture by 4 weeks of age. So just putting in more specifics in areas to emphasize the requirements that have already been there, but to give producers more guidance on how to achieve the objective.
So for new barns, it will be mandatory to comply with the number of exits that is now in the standard. But for existing farms, poultry barns, then if they are not able to renovate or to comply, they still have to prove that the birds are going on the outdoor range.
Yes. Okay. Yes. So they have to demonstrate that the birds are getting out there. They have to manage that range to encourage the birds to go out when the doors that they do have are open, if there's not as many as they've got here.
And you have also imposed a limit on the flock size. What is this limit?
We introduced a limit to flock size for layers of 10,000 birds. There was concerns raised and comments made through the process that the scale of production was getting to be such that it was more and more difficult to actually meet the standards, and that and so some of the intent was being compromised. So we debated different numbers and decided that we could introduce a limit to the flock size for laying hens. We did not come to any agreement about a limit to flock size for chickens, meat birds. But we think this is a start in the right direction. It shows people that, there is a scale where organic production works. If the scale of intensity of production gets too big, then it doesn't really.
Yeah, and if farmers want to have more than 10,000 birds, then they have to have separate sections, totally isolated from one another.
That's correct. I mean, we're not saying if you've got more than that in a big barn, you have to, take half of them out and put them in a different barn. As long as you separate the flocks, so there's into different management with separate runs that are managed separately, then that is acceptable.
And finally, the rabbits, the rabbits, you added many clauses under the rabbit production section.
Well, there are very few. I'm not sure there's even any. Maybe one or two organic rabbit producers that are certified currently in Canada. But before, there was really no guidance either. If people wanted to grow rabbits, there was a few comments about the area that is needed, but very little else compared with all the other sections, which were much more prescriptive. So we did discuss the kind of systems for raising rabbits that we were aware of, and came to some conclusions about what would be appropriate in organic systems. So we've added several clauses here. 5 or 6 paragraphs were added, which elaborates not only the space, but the fact that emphasize the behavior of rabbits. For example, they've got to have the space to run, hop, dig, and sit upright on their back legs. So you can't keep them in a very low cage that's moved around on pasture if they can't sit up and do the things rabbits do.
And you also elaborate the sections about pigs, so that to emphasize on animal welfare for pigs as well.
Yes, we basically expanded this one that talks about the exceptions to when sows and gilts are kept in groups. It seems that paragraph previously had presented some challenges, so we tried to reword it so it was clear, as I mentioned before, that farrowing crates as a means of restraint is prohibited, and when sows are restrained, it's for very specific periods and for specific reasons. So you're allowed to restrain a sow for piglet protection during the suckling period for a maximum of 3 days, or when you need to get into the pen for cleaning or to working with the piglets and things like that. But generally, they've got to have a lot of space, and when they're not suckling, then they have to be in groups.
So thank you, Anne. I think your working group met many times, and you had many subgroups that you had.
Yeah, that's the trouble with livestock. I mean, there's many different types.
Yeah.
And there's a number of different, we had to have different groups to discuss different aspects of it. It was challenging, but I'm pleased with how we ended up. I think some people will think it's not enough and we need to go further, but that will have to wait for the next round.
Yeah, but it's not all about livestock. We also have the section about permitted substances list in livestock production, and it is Janine from Gibson from Manitoba that was the convener of the working group for livestock PSL. Janine, can you summarize the main changes that you introduced in that section?
Certainly. Thank you, Nicole. Our Section 5, Permitted Substances List for Livestock Production, these are the tools that our growers are used to implement the humane livestock practices that Anne worked to clarify in the basic livestock section. And so our section here is divided into two lists, 5.2 and 5.3. 5.1 is feed additives, and feed supplements, and the second being healthcare products and production aids. So what we did with the feed, we're having to tackle with that challenging genetic engineering issue, and we had to look at premixes and our ability to ensure that our animals have the kind of yeast supplements, yeast feeds, autolysates, formulants in the premixes, and so these are some of the specifics that we changed with GE wording that we thought makes it clearer to our growers that substances cannot contain genetically engineered ingredients, but that if it can be demonstrated that something like lactic acid or bacteria is grown on a medium that's a GE substrate, if there's none of it in the end product, that product can be used.
If the fully complying product is not commercially available.
Correct.
Yeah.
And so that's an important flexibility. We're walking a fine line there because we're dealing with the reality of what is happening in industrial agriculture, and we're wanting to implement to the greatest extent possible preventative measures that keep our animals healthy. And we know that that is having quality access, quality feed additives, and the supplements they need, because the weather can be so variable. It can really impact quality of feeds for livestock production. And organic totally focuses on let's keep those animals as healthy as possible. And so we need to be fine-tuning what our growers have access to in terms of minerals. So another example is we were finding that folks didn't quite understand that under the access to minerals that currently exists, that includes oyster shells, that includes calcium chloride, that includes magnesium oxide. And so we added in quite a few sections examples so that people can understand in the broader categories specific examples that they have for feed additives and supplements.
So on the same issue, and you also develop a new preventive tool for reducing antibiotic use in the in livestock operations. You introduced the physical teat seals. What are they? How did you come to that decision to introduce these seals?
Well, we are quite aware of the concern internationally about increased antibiotic resistance. And so we wanted to include a production aid that is being used successfully to reduce antibiotic use against mastitis in the process of drying up dairy cows. And so we introduced under Section 5.1.1 teat seals as an example of a production aid, because originally there were producers saying, we really need this product. Can you introduce the product to the permitted substance list itself and get all of the ingredients improved? And unfortunately, quite a few of the ingredients in many of the products are synthetic, and we weren't prepared to introduce those synthetic products. So we have approached this issue. This was one of our more challenging issues, and lots of debate took place here, I can assure you. Yeah. But we did get consensus that this is a physical product, so it's listed under production aids, and then the annotation to it states that it can, with these management prescriptive aspects, that it's supervised by a vet, and that, so they have to abide completely by the annotation, but that it is allowed even if it does contain synthetics, because they are removed. They're not absorbed by the animal, they are removed, so they don't need to be on the permitted substance list.
But what was the opposition against the use of teat seals? It was simply because it is including synthetics ingredients, or?
That was part of it, not understanding that it's not an input, it's a production aid. So it was drawing that line between something that the cow is absorbing and that could be absorbed into the milk. And so we did have a discussion about filters, and milk is filtered. And this is a physical thing that can be successfully removed if done properly. And because it is somewhat invasive into the teat, it's to be done under vet supervision. And so I think people felt more comfortable with that.
And another issue that you addressed is the use of the status of yeast as a feed.
Yes, yeast autolysate is an important product that folks are using to treat certain conditions, and we wanted to we had to deal with GE again in some ways, so approving yeast to be used organic or not, if it's depending on availability. But also we entered the discussion of whether yeast is an agricultural product. So there was some discussion on that as well.
Okay, but now, if I understand correctly, now it is acceptable to use yeast under the autolyzed form.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Janine. So we now have the pleasure to invite Ted Zettel, the convener of the Apiculture Working Group, to present the modifications to this section of the standard.
Okay, thanks, Nicole. I should emphasize that the Apiculture sub-working group was part of Livestock Working Group, so it was under the supervision of Ann Macy, the Livestock Working Group convener. But I did help with the part that dealt with honey, and we had a little subgroup of honey producers. As most people would know, the organic standard is an attempt to strike a balance between making the very best, purest possible product we can have on the market, and something that the rules that are practical enough that people can actually follow them. So, we can go to one extreme or the other, be so pure that nobody can meet the requirements and you have no organic product, or you can go the other way and have the product not really compromise the integrity of the product by making the rules too lax. So with regard to honey, in livestock, all of livestock requires organic feed and present organic feed, and we take great care in making sure that organic feed is free from prohibited substances. So, we can't use any kinds of toxins in the production. We have to have buffer strips in between our production and our neighbors' fields. And it's not perfect, but it's pretty good. Producers are required to conform to that 100% organic feed, compliant with the standard. With livestock, with bees, which are livestock, it's a little more difficult because the bees actually go out and get their own food. We don't bring the food into the bee hive, and so the location of the hives was always an issue. How can we make sure that these bees forage on crops that aren't contaminated? The original authors of the standard took a very hard line on this, and they established a 3-kilometer buffer strip between the hive and any crop that was treated with a prohibited substance. So if you can imagine, you needed a 6-kilometer big circle around your, from side to side diameter 6 kilometers of free from any agricultural toxins. Basically, we didn't have any certified honey producers in Canada in any agricultural areas because of that rule. And so the committee, I think the subgroup put forward a recommendation that this should be modified, that there should be some leeway in terms of the buffer strip. And that was, in fact, how the outcome of the discussion went. There still is reference to the 3-kilometer buffer zone, but 7.1.10 now, with the new numbering, states that there are exceptions to it. So first of all, the first exception is that fertilizers, which are prohibited substances in the organic standard, are allowed in the buffer zone. So if someone has fertilized with their field next to your hive, that's still allowed. The other thing that's really important is if natural features that would restrict the likelihood of bee travel, such as forests, hills, or waterways, and abundant organic forage are present, buffer zones may be reduced. So this was a very, very contentious clause, but I think that what eventually the outcome was that the majority of the technical committee people thought that they understood after a lot of research that bees will normally forage on the high quality feed that's closest to their hive, that they won't travel 3 kilometers if there is an abundance of feed right close by. So with the new clause, the onus is on the producer to establish and to document, to show that they do have an abundance of organic forage present close to the hive, and then they are relieved from having that 3-kilometer toxin-free radius. So that's a big change in the standard.
And it is probably very helpful in the context of the massive bee decline that we are observing in some countries. But just a precision about the fertilizers. Why are the fertilizers tolerated inside the buffer zones?
Well, I think that the understanding was that with regard to possible contamination of pollen and subsequently a compromise of the quality of honey, that fertilizers were in a much different category than, let's say, herbicides or pesticides. So if you had, for instance, an alfalfa field, conventional alfalfa is usually not sprayed. So it's not sprayed, but it is usually fertilized. So under the old standard, having that field within your 3-kilometer radius would eliminate the hive from conformity. But under the new wording, if there's fertilizer there, but the alfalfa is not sprayed with a toxin of some kind, then that would be okay within the 3 kilometers. So, and alfalfa is a major food source for bees. So it was just to recognize that as far as compromising the quality of honey, fertilizer falls in a different category than some of the other prohibited substances.
And it is also applied before the flowers, before the pollinating is done. So
yeah, that's true, and it normally is quickly absorbed into the soil, so wouldn't likely be coming in contact with bees at all.